Morning, everyone. Children could be facing a return to online lessons for the first time since lockdown if teachers go on strike in the next few weeks. The National Education Union will reveal the results of their strike ballot today of 300,000 teachers in England and Wales. Let's take a look at the planned strike this week, starting with nurses. RCN members will walk out this Wednesday and Thursday. The thing to do here is to keep an eye on the colour coding. Nurses in blue. Another strike by ambulance staff is expected next Monday. Teachers in Scotland begin 16 consecutive school days of strikes today, 16, with different areas of Scotland being affected each day. In pink, or should we say fuchsia. In London, bus drivers are striking today, Thursday, and 2 days next week as well. Over 40 routes will see disruption. On Wednesday, thousands of Environment Agency staff in unison will strike. The first will strike in the agency's 27-year history. That's the one in red for you there. And looking ahead to next month, on the 1st of February, more than 100,000 civil servants in the PCS union will walk out, affecting more than 100 government departments. Teacher strikes in parts of Scotland also continue, as our political correspondent Rob Powell has this report.
From 999 staff and nurses to teachers and trains, another working week brings more disruption. Teachers in Scotland are beginning a 16-day programme of strikes, with schools in Glasgow and East Lothian affected today. Education unions in England and Wales are also due to announce their ballot results, with action expected. One East London head says pay and conditions are making it hard to fill posts.
There are many subjects in our secondary school at the moment we're struggling to fill the vacancies. The teacher training agencies have not managed to recruit in certain core subjects, and all that is as a result of pay and condition of teachers in the classroom.
Ambulance reps will meet today as well to discuss further strike dates after a weekend that saw one health union accuse the government of demonising workers about patient safety. The standoff is particularly bitter over the issue of NHS pay, but while some in government have concluded that a higher wage settlement is now needed for health workers, the Treasury is insisting that all departments live within their existing budgets. Today will also see controversial new laws debated here in the Commons that would force unions in health, transport and education to provide a minimum level of service on strike days.
What's absolutely clear about it is the complete lack of detail. What it states is that the Secretary of State can define minimum service levels, and that puts us in a frankly terrible position whereby these decisions can be made arbitrary.
There's more optimism on the trains, with a new offer expected to be made to workers this week. Rail unions remain cautious, though, saying any deal needs to be put down on paper before progress can be made. Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
And at 8:30, we'll talk to two union bosses, the NEU, National Education Union, who are announcing that strike ballot today, and the head of the Scottish Teaching Union. Now, in other news for you, the black box of the plane that crashed in Nepal has been found as investigators try to work out what caused the country's worst air crash in 30 years. 72 passengers and crew were aboard the Yeti Airlines flight, which was seen rolling sharply before it came down. Rhiannon Mills reports.
You can hear people shouting, unsure what to do as the plane burns. The Yeti Airlines flight deep in the ravine below them. Difficult to spot any signs of survivors among the smoke. As the haze moves away, the spread of the wreckage is clearer. Half on the hillside, what was once a window and a seat close to where crowds were gathering. The rest of the fuselage lying in the river gorge underneath. Nepal's Prime Minister promising any help that's needed.
दुखद भयो हैन अब यसको उद्धार कार्यको निम्ति सम्पूर्ण शक्ति लगाइएको छ नेपाली सेना सशस्त्र प्रहरी सबै.
This was filmed by a passenger in those final seconds. What appears to be a normal approach, everything calm, nothing seems wrong. Hard to watch, the plane was also filmed from the ground close to Pokhara Airport. You can see the aircraft rolling sharply on its side before it disappears.
मुझे मालूम नहीं था कि वो क्रैश होने वाला है। तो जैसे मैंने शूट किया तो प्लेन, जैसे कि आप उस वीडियो में देख सकते हो, प्लेन अचानक से वो टिल्ट हो जाता है, जैसे कि वो फाइटर प्लेन जैसे कि मिसाइल को डॉज करने के लिए टिल्ट होता है ना।
On board, 4 crew and 68 passengers, including 15 from overseas. The focus now is on the 15-year-old ATR-72 aircraft and its crew as they determine the factors that led to the country's worst air crash in 30 years. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News.
Well, the black box, as I said, has been found. Neville standing by for us. That will obviously have more clues for us, Neville. What do we know so far about what tragically happened yesterday?
Well, now questions are being raised about the crash, because yesterday when the plane crashed, the weather was quite clear. The sun was shining. There was no fog or any sort of winter effects on Pokhara at that point of time. There are questions also being raised why the Pokhara International Airport was pushed by the government to open its airstrip. Also, why the pilot had requested to land from a different runway, rather from the western side of the strip rather than the assigned one to him. Now, Nepal doesn't have a very good track record in terms of air safety. Since 2000, over 350 people have died in aircraft and helicopter crashes across the country. The European Union in 2013 has put a blanket ban on Nepalese airlines coming into the airspace of the Union, and we've seen a boom in the airline industry in Nepal, which many are questioning the concerns of a compromise to safety regulations in the country. But now that the investigations are taking place, the Prime Minister Prachanda has given a 45-day deadline to this 5-member group committee to investigate into the causes. We'll have to wait and see what were the real causes of this crash.
OK, for now, Neville, thank you. Now, also this morning, a man has been arrested following a shooting. That's outside a church near London's Euston Station over the weekend. Joining us now is Ivor. A man arrested, Ivor. What more do we know? Good morning.
Good morning, Kay. Yes, so the 22-year-old is now in custody, being held on suspicion of attempted murder after being arrested yesterday afternoon around 4 p.m. in Barnet in North London. That's around 5 miles from here, and police say the arrest was made after a car was stopped. It's the first arrest that's been made in connection with this shooting outside this church here in North London, right next to Euston Station. The back of the station is just around 30 metres to my left here. Meanwhile, of course, those who were caught up in this shooting remain in hospital. The youngest victim is still fighting for her life. Police say a 7-year-old girl remains in a stable but life-threatening condition. 4 women are still in hospital, including a 48-year-old who police say has suffered potentially life-changing injuries, while a 12-year-old girl who suffered leg injuries, police say, is expected to make a full recovery. The shooting happened here on Saturday afternoon around 1:30. The mourners had been at a memorial service inside the church for a young woman, and her mother had then come outside when police believe a gunman opened fire with a shotgun from a car. And after making this arrest, they are still appealing for anyone with any information to come forward, especially anyone who witnessed this shooting.
OK, for now, thank you. Looking at what's making the front pages of the papers for you this morning, the teachers' strikes are on the front of the eye, with warnings that students face a return to online lessons. The Guardian: fury over PM's bid to hand police sweeping powers to halt protests, reads The Guardian, as Rishi Sunak plans for a public order crackdown. The Times leads with the crisis facing the NHS. Their headline: 2 in 3 voters think NHS offers bad service. Call this a cure for NHS, Sakir, reads the front of the Mail, as health experts hit out at Labour's plan to let patients refer themselves for treatment without seeing a GP. And the Telegraph reports on the arrest of a man in his 60s on suspicion of a terror offence after traces of uranium were found in a cargo package at Heathrow Airport. Some of today's other headlines for you this morning on The Breakfast Show. A man in his 60s arrested on suspicion of a terror offence after traces of uranium were found in a cargo package at Heathrow. Police say they arrested the man in Cheshire on Saturday. He was later released on bail. Border Force officers discovered the radioactive substance with a shipment of scrap metal. Jamaican authorities have seized an estimated £74 million worth of cocaine in one of the biggest drug busts ever in the country. Officials discovered the shipment hidden inside a cargo ship at the port of Kingston. Jamaica has long been used as a hub by transnational criminal organisations to move weapons and drugs, including sending cocaine to North America and also to Europe. A walker's been airlifted to hospital with multiple injuries after he was swept over a waterfall in Dumfries and Galloway. A rescue operation was launched after the man lost his footing and fell into the water near Moffat. The current took him over one 10 to 15 metre high waterfall, but he narrowly avoided a 60 metre drop. Police will get more powers to clamp down on protests by shutting them down before they start causing disruption. The government is tabling an amendment to its public order bill to allow police to intervene in long-running campaigns, including the likes of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. Let's get more from Amanda, who's standing by for us. So tell us more about this, Amanda. When does it come into place and who might it impact?
Yes, so this is the public order bill which is currently being looked at by the House of Lords. The government just introducing a new amendment which will give the police more power to crack down on what the government's describing as new guerrilla tactics used by campaign groups like Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion, things like slow walking protests which will disrupt traffic in city centres or blocking roads in other ways. Now, controversially, the change means that the police don't need to wait for protests to actually begin if they're deemed to be seriously disruptive before actually stepping in and shutting them down. Now, the government say they're acting on requests from the police for greater legal clarity. The Prime Minister, in some comments released around this announcement, has said it's a fundamental right that people have to be able to protest, but it also needs to be balanced by the right for ordinary people to go about their day-to-day lives without facing disruption. Perhaps unsurprisingly, campaign groups have reacted with absolute outrage, and human rights organisations like Liberty say it's an attack on the right to protest and saying it effectively gives the police a blank cheque to actually shut down dissent before it's even happened. Now, Labour say they believe that the police already have all the powers they need to tackle dangerous protests. And this does come after new laws were introduced just last year, which tightened the rules around protesting, including things like allowing the police to set noise restrictions for protests, for example. Now, the police themselves have welcomed this. They say it's for Parliament to set out what the law should be on this, arguing that they're facing many long-running legal disputes when they're trying to carry out their duties policing protests. But it certainly looks like quite a provocative move from a government already taking on the unions with their anti-strike legislation. This really does seem to be a move which is certainly firing up their core voters and enraging their opponents.
OK, Amanda, thank you. Now, let's talk about the weather, should we? It looks like there's a cold snap on the way. Temperatures are expected to fall as low as -10 degrees Celsius. Wow. And the Met Office is warning this could cause travel disruption today. The drop in temperature comes after widespread flooding, which has left big parts of the country submerged this last week. Looking at that in a bit more detail, the Met Office issued a yellow warning across many parts of the UK for snow and ice. Let's get more, should we? Steph standing by for us this morning. Hi, Steph. How bad is it going to be? Good morning.
Hello there. Yes, well, we do have a fair amount of snow in Scotland. That's where we're going to see the majority of the snow showers. Further south, where we saw those beautiful snowy pictures, we have an ice warning in force there. That's over parts of Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, also across into North Wales, Northern England and the northern parts of the Midlands. That's where there's a lot of ice around at the moment because we've had so many showers. And then the southeast corner here, we've had a lot of wet weather too. There's some very heavy downpours. A bit of that is turning a little bit wintry. We're seeing some sleet. We're seeing a little bit of snow, but that's moving away. And I think by lunchtime, that largely should have cleared away. And then it'll will be actually quite a nice day, Kay, for many places. Many places will see some sunshine. We'll have a few showers here and there, but it will be cold. As you said, instead of wall-to-wall rain, will be in parts of Scotland.
We lost you for just a second there. We've got the gist of what you were telling us, though. Have we got another question for her? Are we just not going to risk it? OK, we won't. But do be very careful if you were driving in this morning. There's a lot of standing water on the roads. Just be really, really careful when you're driving. Now, a British woman has died after being caught in an avalanche near Mont Blanc. The 45-year-old was hiking with 2 other people when the avalanche hit. A French search and rescue unit airlifted her to Chamonix, but was unable to revive her. Her death is the 4th in the French Alps in the past week alone. And with parts of the world experiencing extreme weather conditions, let's have a look at the impact of climate change on the planet. Here we go. This is our dashboard. Yep, there it is. No coal at all again, as you can see, being used. Renewables up to 52.5%. That's what we like to see, isn't it? And this is the temperature since 1880, Industrial Revolution, of course, and this is the CO2 emissions in millions of tonnes, importing 3.7% of our energy as we speak. Those are real-time numbers, changing absolutely all the time. Meantime, heavy snow has fallen in parts of Iran's capital, Tehran. Have a look at these pictures. Roads were blocked and flights halted as the city struggled against freezing conditions and thick fog. Conditions in some areas were so bad that schools were forced to turn to online teaching. Several museums and historical sites were also closed to conserve energy as the country struggles against a shortage of natural gas. Down to -10 in places here in the UK today. So if you are going out, make sure you take your big coat with you. Now, the Football Association has condemned an incident involving Arsenal's Aaron Ramsdale after a spectator tried to kick the goalkeeper in his back. Following the team's 2-0 win over local rivals Tottenham, the fans seemed to jump onto an advertising hoarding behind the Arsenal goal before appearing to aim a kick at the goalie's back. Ramsdale addressed the incident after the match.
The Spurs fans were giving me some throughout the second half. I gave them some back, which, so that the few people who I did do it to was probably well greeted, sportsmanship like. And then a fan tried to, I jumped over and give me a little punch in the back. So, yeah, that's what happened, and it's a shame because it's just a game of football at the end of the day.
Well, in a statement, the FA said, "We strongly condemn the incident involving a spectator that followed today's Premier League fixture between Tottenham Hotspur and Arsenal. This is wholly unacceptable behaviour, and we will work together with the police, the relevant authorities and the clubs to ensure the appropriate action is taken." At least 35 people have reportedly died after an apparent block was hit by a missile attack in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro on Saturday. Emergency workers searched the rubble for survivors, dismantling dangerous parts of the building, which had been home to almost 2,000 people. The city's mayor says the chances of saving people now are minimal. Meantime, Belarus to start Air Force drills with Russia. They say the exercise is purely defensive and is to prepare for possible combat missions. The move comes as concern grows that Moscow is pushing Minsk to join the war in Ukraine. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is set to make a statement in the House of Commons today on the UK's latest decision to send tanks to Ukraine. Lots then to talk to our guest about. Ben Barry, former Director of British Army Staff, UK Ministry of Defence. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. We saw that absolute tragedy over the weekend when an apartment block with 2,000 people inside was targeted by the Russians. What more do we know?
Well, I think we know that most of them actually got out, but sadly there's been some casualties. I mean, this is all part of Russia's campaign to attack Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power, heating, and the railways. Some of the cruise missiles they're firing are pretty accurate, but at the moment they seem to be firing a lot of less accurate ballistic missiles and obsolete naval cruise missiles. So it isn't surprising, I'm afraid.
Can attacks like this be described as war crimes?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. If they are actually aimed at a military target and they've gone off course, that's probably not a war crime. But if they've actually been deliberately aimed at the Ukrainian civil population, for example, if they were deliberately aimed at that apartment block, there would be a case to answer for a war crime.
Talk to me more generally then, if you would, please, sir, about Vladimir Putin saying his special military operation, I'm quoting him directly, is developing within the framework of the plan. Does that mean the tide is changing in this war?
Well, the tide's changed several times. It changed in spring when the Russians failed to attack Kiev and withdrew from it, turning their main effort to the Donbass. It's changed again with the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive at Kharkiv, and more recently with the counteroffensive at Kherson. It seems at the moment that Russia just doesn't have the offensive combat power on the ground to be able to recapture substantive territory, hence much of the front lines turning into attrition, rather like a First World War battlefield.
You talked about how he's changed his top commander on the ground several times, done that again over the last week or so. Every time that happens, we seem to see even bloodier, more deadly attacks. Do you think that is each of them trying to prove that they are more successful at trying to win this war than the previous one?
Well, that may well be the case, Kay. Of course, the previous commander remains in the chain of command, but General Gerasimov, who's the overall Russian forces chief, has now taken charge of the whole operation. Whether, though, he can think of any new strategic gambits that will unlock the battlefield, that's a difficult question to answer, because, of course, the war began badly with considerable over-optimism displayed by Russia and a high level of strategic and military incompetence. Whether he can make the Russian forces much more competent, I should say, is an open question, I think.
Who's winning this war at the moment?
Well, yes, they still seem to have a difficulty properly coordinating combined arms, for example. Even with the addition of the Wagner private military company, they're finding it very difficult to concentrate sufficient force at a decisive point to break through. Whereas on the other hand, Ukraine's fighting a strong defensive battle and continuing to use its US-supplied HIMARS rocket launchers and other Western weapons, as well as its special forces and partisans, to attack Russian positions throughout their depth. So the chances of a Russian breakthrough in the near future, I think, are pretty low.
Including the promise of 14 Challenger 2 tanks from the British government. Going to hear more on that from the Defence Secretary in the House of Commons later on today. We're speaking to the Lord Dunnett last week. He says that's nowhere near enough. What do you think?
Well, Ukraine's been very clear. It said it wants a minimum of 300 modern Western tanks, 14 British tanks and about a dozen Polish tanks that Poland has in principle said it's delivered, is only a small proportion of that. That's 2 companies of tanks at most, whereas what Poland's asking for is about 6 battalions worth of tanks. Now, there are a lot of modern Western tanks in Europe. There's 2,000 odd Leopard 2 tanks, which is the sort that Poland's supplying. And it ought to be not too difficult for European NATO nations that have Leopard 2 to club together to find about 400 Leopard tanks.
There's an issue, though, isn't there, with these Leopard tanks? Perhaps you could explain that to us. It's a German licence, and so there's a sticking point.
Yes, they're German built, and under the terms in which they were sold to the countries concerned, Germany has a veto on them being sold to a third party. Now, Germany, of course, is a nation that has a degree of institutional pacifism built into its constitution. And in the past, it's refused to supply weapons to an active theatre of war. Although Chancellor Scholz, shortly after the war began, in his speech saying Germany was at a Zeitenwende, a turning point, implied that Germany would become much more assertive in exporting weapons to Ukraine. They have, of course, exported weapons from anti-tank weapons to the recent declaration of about a battalion's worth of Marder infantry fighting vehicles. But there still seems to be a degree of political and institutional reluctance in Germany But we will see shortly there's to be a NATO nation summit of the contact group with Ukraine, including all the nations beyond NATO. And that's to coordinate arms and equipment supplies and deliveries to Ukraine. And it may be that Poland and the UK have both acted in a way to encourage Germany to remove the restrictions on the exports of Leopard 2 tanks.
Sure. But to that end, Christine Lambrecht, I think I'm right in saying the Defence Minister is basically on her last legs when it comes to her political position. There's a lot of criticism internally for her lack of action. What sort of challenges do you think that political disharmony in Germany, what sort of challenges do you think that could play out in the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, if Germany makes difficulties about this approach to sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, Ukraine will have less combat power than it would like. We need to be clear that the reason Ukraine said it wants 300 tanks and 600 or 700 infantry fighting vehicles, as well as another 500 additional howitzers, is so it can build up heavy armoured or mechanized formations to mount a strategic counteroffensive this year to evict Russia from Ukraine. If no one supplies more than the current 25 odd modern Western tanks that the British and the Poles have declared, Ukraine's going to find that a lot more difficult.
Coming up, we're going to be speaking in more detail about the Scotland gender bill. What is Rishi Sunak going to do about that? Time is running out for him to block it if that's his plan. Chatting about that in just a moment or two. Before that, though, the Australian Open kicked off overnight with a familiar face returning to Melbourne. Yeah. Novak Djokovic received an adoring welcome on his first public return to the Australian Open. He played a practice match ahead of the tournament against the maverick Australian Nick Kyrgios. I always pronounce his name wrong. Speaking on court, the Serbian, who was deported before last year's tournament due to his COVID-19 vaccination status, said, "I feel a bit emotional. I was looking forward to coming back to this court." He starts his run in Melbourne tomorrow against the Spaniard Roberto Baena. Also, check out these pictures today. Some of the ones that caught our eye. This yellow, good morning. Remember, it's Blue Monday. Look at these little guys. They are just a couple of the record number of seals that have been spotted on a 5-mile stretch of coast in Norfolk. A total of 3,796 seal pups have been born so far this winter, while 1,169 adults have been spotted by volunteers. Who counts them? And how do they know they're not double counting? There you go, 3,796. Half of the world's population of grey seals live around the British coastline, and places like Horsey in Norfolk are important breeding areas, is what I'm told. That's a great shot as well. Now, the deadline for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to decide whether to block Scotland's gender laws will arrive this Wednesday. The bill would allow trans people to obtain a gender recognition certificate without the need for medical diagnosis. Joined now by campaigner Ellie Gomersall, who is president of the National Union of Students in Scotland. Hello to you. It's good to see you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. Subject very close to your heart. Tell us about your journey through transitioning.
Well, I came out as trans when I was 18. That was about 5 years ago now. I'm 23 now. I had a really positive experience. All of my friends and family were really, really supportive. I have to admit, though, I often joke that the hardest thing about being trans is the admin. and I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's been one of the biggest barriers, one of the biggest hurdles for me. I've been able to update things like my passport, my driving license, etc., to reflect my name and my gender. The one thing that I've not been able to do is update my birth certificate, and that's because that requires one of these gender recognition certificates in order to do that. That's all a gender recognition certificate does, actually. It allows you to update your birth certificate, and that that means that if you're getting married, you can make sure that the marriage is being recorded with you and your correct gender. It means also that if you pass away, that you can have dignity in death by ensuring that the death certificate is recorded correctly. Now, I've not been able to get that certificate because I've been on the waiting list for the NHS gender identity clinics for that medical diagnosis for coming up for 5 years now. I've not had an initial appointment yet. I'm still waiting. I don't know when that's going to be. And that means that under the current process, if I wanted to get that gender recognition certificate to update my birth certificate, I would have to pay for a private psychiatric assessment. I mean, that costs hundreds of pounds on top of all of the other costs related to gathering all of the other documents that they ask you to submit to this sort of panel of so-called experts who will never actually meet you to determine whether you're man enough or woman enough to update your birth certificate. So that's been a real barrier to me. And so I was really, really excited and really happy that the bill in Scotland that we've been campaigning on for so long finally passed back in December to make that process just a little bit easier.
Can you, when you are 16 years old, know that this sort of decision that will change your life forever is the right one?
I think you absolutely can. I mean, I certainly did. I didn't come out until I was 18, but I think I always knew that I was trans. And actually, there's so many young trans kids who have transitioned, some of them at primary school and have lived, the vast majority of their lives by the time that they're 16 in their new gender. And I think what's really important when we're talking about this particular bill is that all it is about updating your birth certificate. That's all that the gender recognition certificate does. We're not talking about medical treatments here. We're not talking about anything else. We're talking about a piece of paper, which, worst case scenario, if years later down the line, actually realize, what, that wasn't right for me. That's not going to change your entire life if you need to change that back. So we are just talking about a bit of paper here. And I think when we're talking about 16, 17-year-olds in particular, I mean, right now in Scotland, 16-year-olds can vote in Scottish elections, can get married. I mean, you can have a child, you can join the army. I think, a lot of those last couple of ones, that's a much bigger impact on your life than, updating the gender that's marked on your birth certificate. So I think that not only is 16 young enough, I think that actually in the cases where, kids have been living in their current gender for almost their entire lives at some point, the majority of their childhoods, actually, I think that the bill doesn't go far enough. And there does need to be provision in the future for younger people to be able to, with the support, and the right guidance and advice, be able to update, their birth certificates to get that gender recognition certificate as well. Because if you're a trans young person who's been, at school, a lot of maybe the kids at high school, if you transition to primary school, don't even know that you're trans. And then maybe you're going to college or university for the first time or getting your first job. You don't have any other forms of ID, and having to present that birth certificate that has the wrong name and gender on it, I think can be really difficult and stigmatizing for that young person.
Do you feel that, given that, you're an expert on this matter, do you feel that you could put a number on that age limit?
Well, I think that, it's something that needs to be looked at in more detail. I think, I couldn't say because, I wasn't a kid myself when I did come out exactly what that age should be. But I think that a lot of campaigners are talking about, sort of, 10, that sort of age. But, I think that the point is that we've not looked into this enough about, kids who are under 16, but we have talked for a very, very long time about 16, 17-year-olds in Scotland. I mean, this discussion has been going on for about 6-7 years now, since the leaders of all of the parties in the Scottish Parliament, including the Conservative Party, first committed to these reforms. So I think that we've had so many years of consultation and talking about this issue that I think that we have reached a solid conclusion here on 16, 17-year-olds, and we need to have more discussions about younger people than that to make sure that those people in the future are able to access gender recognition certificates as well.
As you know, Sir Keir Starmer does not agree with you. He thinks that 16 is too young for a young person to decide on paperwork when it relates to their gender. And we know that the British government also has concerns about the bureaucracy of having different rules in Scotland than for the rest of the Union, and could in fact, as a result, block this bill. What would you say to the Prime Minister this morning?
Well, I would say look at the bill, look at what it actually does, look at where it actually changes the law. I think when we've been talking about this bill, and in particular, the lines that have been coming from the UK government all relate to the Equality Act, the Equality Act 2010, which is the law that puts into place anti-discrimination measures, etc. It's the law that currently means that trans people are able to access spaces, for instance, that match the gender that we are, rather than the sex that we were assigned at birth. And I think that all of these conversations don't actually relate to the really simple process of updating your birth certificate, which is what this bill actually does. I think that we've ended up getting into all of these conversations about different provisions that the bill doesn't actually change. So what I'd say to both the Prime Minister and to Keir Starmer is look at what the bill actually does and listen to the people who have been looking at this for years, particularly to Keir Starmer. The Scottish Labour Party fully supported these reforms. Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, has also said that if Wales had the same powers as Scotland, then this would be something that the Welsh government should be looking at as well. And in the Conservatives, Theresa May has supported these reforms, and a number of Scottish Conservative MSPs also voted for the bill back in December. So I'd say listen to the people who have been working on this for years. Look at the legislation, look at what it does and doesn't do. And I think that once you've done that, the facts are really simple.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's completely correct to say that it was fully supported by the Labour Party in Scotland. It wasn't fully supported by the SNP as well, really. If I could quote Joanna Cherry to you from the SNP, not at all happy about women's safety and what may happen as a result of this bill. She says the bill will allow any man to declare himself a woman and to gain the legal status of woman for all or most purposes after 3 months of living as a woman. What it means to live as a woman is also left undefined, and some using that as an example of previously being recognised as a man, now being recognised as a woman and being potentially in a woman's jail.
Well, I think there's a lot of things to unpack here. First of all, I think that it's right that we don't have a state-defined definition of what womanhood means. I think that would be really dangerous, not just for trans people, but for women across the country. If there was a strict set of guidelines as to what it meant to be a woman, that would be really worrying. When it comes to things like jails, again, that's something that's covered under the Equality Act 2010. This bill doesn't change that. And if you actually look at, again, the Equality Act 2010, if you look at paragraph 28 of the Equality Act, there's a specific section in there which talks about when there is a legal need to still be able to discriminate. So that means that when we're talking about things like jail, for instance, if there was a genuine threat, for example, for someone going to, say, a women's prison, then under the Equality Act, Act, that can still be broken. And that's regardless of whether you've got a gender recognition certificate or not. It doesn't come into it. So I think that when we're then talking about whether or not a man would be able to fraudulently claim that he was a woman and get a gender recognition certificate, I'd ask, well, why on earth would a predatory man do that? Why would they go through that process of getting a piece of paper that allows them to update their birth certificate? That doesn't change their access to things like single-sex spaces, for instance. All it does is it means that, the birth certificate now says that they're a woman. If they were to get married, they'd be recorded as a bride, and their death certificate would say that they were a woman. I don't see any reason why any predatory man would see that as a bonus or a way to access, being a predator.
Okay. Eloquently put, Ellie. It's good to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time this morning. Much appreciated. Thank you. So what is the British government going to do today? We heard Sir Keir Starmer yesterday saying that he was not content with 16-year-olds making that life decision. Tamara's here. Good morning.
Good morning, Kay.
What's the option?
Well, it sounds as if they may well choose to block this law passed by the Scottish Government just before Christmas in what they described as a breakthrough moment for equality. But what happens is when the Scottish Government passes a law, you've got 4 weeks for the Westminster Government to stop it becoming law. Now, that power has never been used before since devolution in the late 1990s. So this is a big moment, not just for gender politics, but also for devolution as well. Well, Rishi Sunak has said he has concerns about it, not just about the access to single-sex spaces, which is something that other cabinet ministers have spoken about, but about whether it puts people in Scotland in a different legal category to England, whether it conflicts with equalities laws, because if someone in Scotland is allowed to change their gender legally without this gender dysphoria medical diagnosis, without living in their acquired gender for 2 years, only for 3 months, and then it applies also to 16 and 17-year-olds, that's probably the most controversial bit, then if someone from Scotland with that new legal status came to England, could they access services that they wouldn't be able to? Would you create what's being described as gender tourism, where people go to Scotland to acquire that status and then come back again? Is there a problem with how it affects the rest of the UK where this does not apply? So the government say no decision has been made and they're looking at the legal advice about it, but a decision could come as soon as today, and I think all the indications are that Rishi Sunak may choose to go ahead and block it based on that legal advice, which would, of course, infuriate Scottish politicians.
We'll find out about that, and indeed the teachers' strike a bit later on today. Tamara Fanai, thanks very much. Indeed. Something else I want to talk to you about this morning. The government having announced they're no longer supporting small businesses through the Energy Bill Relief Programme. The scheme is designed to support businesses and public sector organisations such as schools and hospitals by providing a discount on wholesale gas and electricity prices. The Federation of Small Businesses have said this is a huge disappointment. Joining us now is Tina McKenzie, Policy Chair at the Federation of Small Businesses. Hi, Tina. Good to see you this morning. Thanks for joining us. What are you most worried about?
Well, we're really concerned about the amount of small firms across the country that aren't going to be able to cope with the huge increases they're going to see when the current scheme is abandoned in April. The government are putting in a new scheme, but it's really not going to help small businesses very much. And therefore, we're concerned about small businesses either closing or having to downsize even more than some of them already have.
So what support was this scheme offering previously?
So this scheme currently offered businesses, small and large, actually, a cap on their energy costs. As we've seen due to the Ukraine war, that energy prices just skyrocketed and most businesses wouldn't have been able to survive. Certainly a lot of businesses, we see from our reports, do not have the cash flows that they previously had, cash reserves before COVID, therefore put them in a very vulnerable position. The government acknowledged this, acknowledged we were in an unusual situation with these bills that were just not payable by, especially by small businesses, and therefore put in a cap on the amount of electricity bill and gas bill that you may have per kilowatt hour. So what they've decided to do is to gamble now, that because wholesale gas prices are coming down, to gamble now and get rid of the scheme completely and bring in a kind of a new scheme, but really doesn't offer much at all, offers pennies to businesses. And we're quite concerned about the fact that the government are gambling with the energy market, assuming that businesses can handle the flux and the fact that they don't know what's going to happen with their energy prices.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Tina. Let's bring in Abdul Mahid. He runs the post office and kitchen and is with us now. Hi, good to see you. What sort of impact will this have on your business? Good morning.
Good morning, Kay. Excuse me. The cap helped us budget how much our costs were, and then we could manage the overall cost to the business. But by removing the cap, we're in free fall, open to the fluctuations of the energy prices. So for me personally, I'm going to see my energy rise by £1,500 a month when this cap is removed. So that's about 18,000 a year straight off my bottom line. So it has a serious impact on my business. Like I say, it impacts how we manage the store, staffing, and ultimately how we serve the community.
So what sort of appeal would you make to the government this morning?
I think we need some sort of certainty. I think by removing the cap gave us that certainty, and that allowed us to do our budgets and our plans based on that figure. But by removing the cap, we're basically put in the hands of the energy providers, and there's huge fluctuations. Many retailers are in contracts where now we'll see a huge rise in the prices, and these prices cannot be passed on through increased prices to the customers, because we're in a competitive market, and the money has to be found somewhere, either through personal sacrifices or staffing. But everything that we do or plan to do to save money will impact the business, which ultimately you're in a vicious spiral down into your viability overall.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to hear the impact that it's having on you. Hopefully the government will be listening this morning and listen to what you have to say. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you. I want to talk to you about what's happened in Nepal. You'll see that there was a plane crash yesterday in Nepal. All of those on board are thought to have perished. What on earth could have happened? The black box has been found. It will take some time to decipher that. Aviation consultant Alistair Rosenshine is with us. Hi, Alistair. What a tragedy. What do you make of what happened?
Well, as you say, a terrible tragedy, as these accidents always are. Look, what we have at the moment is it's been reported that the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder have been found. So the authorities' investigation will be able to find out pretty soon exactly what happened. But what we do have is a video of the aircraft on the approach, and it seems to be rolling rather rapidly to the left, and that would suggest that the aircraft may have lost flying speed. In other words, what we call in aviation a stall. It's also not very clear in the video whether or not the flaps were deployed, which they should be when it comes into land.
Okay, so what can we gather from that? The plane was too low and it stalled?
Well, it's impossible to see in the video whether or not the aircraft's too low, but the rate of roll would indicate that flying speed had been lost. It would be extraordinary to think that pilots would have allowed an aircraft to roll rapidly to the left like that. So whether it's mechanical failure, flight control failure, engine failure, or something of that nature, one doesn't know. But it could equally be a handling error whereby the aircraft was allowed to become too slow on the approach.
Why does Nepal have such a terrible record when it comes to airline safety? 300 people plus have died since the year 2000 in the air.
Well, that's you're quite right. There have been 27 accidents in the last 30 years, but Nepal is an area of very, very high mountains and rapidly changing weather. So many accidents are due to that combination of factors. You're doing an approach into a small airport with high ground in poor weather. And so a number of these accidents have involved actually hitting the ground early, what we call a controlled flight into terrain, a CFIT accident. Others have involved departing the runway, again, because of very poor weather conditions in that area. But the Nepalese airlines are, in fact, banned from entering the EU airspace at the moment, simply because their safety record is so poor.
Wow, goodness me. OK, it's always good to talk to you, Alistair. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.